could spend a lot of time this morning just introducing Dr. Hassan, but we boiled it down to some basic elements. And you may not know that she is actually more Kentuckian than a lot of Kentuckians because she's been in the Bluegrass State for quite a while now. She's a Pakistani-American. She earned her bachelor's degree with honors in English and philosophy and her Ph.D. in philosophy at Durham University in England. She started teaching at the University of Louisville in 1976. She's the author of 8 books and has contributed to dozens of other books, articles, and newspapers. She's recognized internationally as a pioneer of Islamic feminist theology. She's an activist known for promoting women's rights in Muslim societies and for combating so-called honor crimes against women in Pakistan. So she has a lot that we want to hear, so I won't delay things anymore. Dr. Riffat Hassan speaking on Muslim women, Qur'anic teachings versus cultural practices. So Dr. Hassan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ron. Good morning, Assalamu alaikum to all the Muslims here. And I thought that the choice of prayers was very, very interesting and important because Addison recited the Lord's Prayer and Ron recited the Surah Fatiha, the opening surah of the Quran, and the two are very similar in content. So that's a point worth noting. I am greatly honored and pleased to be here this morning and to share some of my life's journey and my work with you. Ron has already told you that I am originally from Pakistan. I come from the city of Lahore, which is a very old city and is the cultural capital of the country. I come from a Sayyid Muslim family. Sayyids are believed to be the descendants of the Prophet Muhammad. And my ancestors came from Arabia at some point and lived for quite a while in Herat, which is in Afghanistan, and then they came to Lahore. And the area in which I live is called Muslim Town, which was started by my ancestors. And I live on my house is located on a street called Faiz Road, and Faiz was my grandfather, who was a police officer, and the road is named after him. So, you know, I have always been a Muslim. You can't get much more Muslim than what I've just told you. But I did not always understand the issues relating to women, which later on became central to my life. So what I'm planning to do today is I will talk to you about my journey, both as a Muslim woman and as a theologian, and how I traveled from being a theologian to being an activist and where I am today, okay? So anyway, as a child, I experienced the cultural attitudes towards girls and women. I came from a family of 9 children, and we were 4 sisters and 5 brothers. And my father was a conservative Muslim, very kind person, but conservative in his values. My mother was an ultra-radical feminist. When they were married, she was 16, he was 32. And my parents never agreed on anything, ever. And the point of the greatest contention between them was how to bring up their daughters. Because my father believed that girls should be married at age 16 to whoever was picked out for them. And my mother did not believe that. She believed very strongly in educating her daughters. So anyhow, I grew up in a house with tremendous conflict. And when I was 17, and I had finished school, and I had done my first 2 years in college, I went to the University of England, University of Durham in England, where I stayed for the next 7 years. I studied English literature and philosophy. And so I got my first degree, and then I got my Ph.D. And I returned to Pakistan. So the place from where I want to pick up this thread of my life, because there's not enough time to share everything with you, is that I want to start with the year 1974. This was the time when I was teaching as a visiting professor at the University at Oklahoma State University in a place called Stillwater, Oklahoma. Very tiny place, actually lived up to its name. And at that time, I had an infant daughter, and I was a single mother. So my journey starts here. That university had many student organizations, and one of the important ones was what was called the Muslim Students Association. Muslim student associations exist on virtually every campus in the United States and Canada. So there was one at OSU. The university had a policy that they would, they mandated that every student body or every student association should have a faculty member as their advisor. And it so happened that I was the only Muslim faculty member on campus that year. So of necessity, I became their faculty advisor. This group of students were all from the area of Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and the United Emirates. This comprises some of the most conservative areas in the Islamic world, and they were all men. Women were not allowed to be a part of this association, even though many of the students were married and their wives did a lot of work, cooking and cleaning and secretarial work and so on, but they were not allowed even to attend their events. So when I was appointed their advisor, they had a huge problem with it, but they couldn't do anything about it. I taught them Islamic studies, but they still had a lot of sort of, I wouldn't call it hostility, but they were not pleased, certainly, with the fact that I was their advisor. So this group used to have an event every fall. This was a seminar to which they invited speakers from outside. This was their big event of the year. And it was customary that the faculty advisor would say a few words at the start of the seminar on whatever was the topic of the seminar. However, in my case, the students came to me and they said, we would like you to talk about the place or role of women in Islam. That was not the topic of the seminar, but they didn't think I should talk about anything else. As I said, I taught them Islamic studies, but that didn't give them the confidence that I was able to talk about Islam in general. And I accepted that. I understood why they had asked me to speak on a subject that was not the topic of the seminar. But I accepted that invitation for two reasons. One was that this group of men, as I have already described, was so patriarchal in its attitude they wouldn't allow women even in the audience. And they certainly didn't want to hear a woman speaker. In fact, there were quite a few of them who believed that hearing the voice of a woman who was not related to them was haram, means forbidden. So I said, okay, they have invited me, so now at least they will have to hear what I have to say. That's one reason. The other reason was a more serious reason, and that was that I had come across, I can't tell you how many, hundreds of publications, books, articles, brochures, and so on the subject of the role and place and status of women in Islam. And they were all virtually written by men. To date, I have never come across anything written on the status and role and place of man in Islam. So perhaps one can conclude from that that men have no role or status and so on. But anyhow, so I thought that I wanted to look at the issue of women from a different point of view, not from the point of view that had already been expressed in so many writings. So this invitation had come to me in the summer of that year, that was 74. And this event was in the fall. So I had 3 or 4 months before the actual event. So I started to think about it, and I said, what should I focus on? Now, I have always used the Quran as a textbook in the classes that I taught on Islam. But until that time, I had not done a focused study of the Qur'anic texts that relate to women and women's issues. So I thought I would study that. And so I started reading the Quran from that point of view. And it took me a few months to get through the text. And by the time I came to the end of it, I was extremely angry. And why was I angry? I was angry because I saw for the first time in my life that there is a big gap, big discrepancy between what the Quran says about women and women's rights and responsibilities and what is actually happening to women in Muslim cultures. So that was a very painful experience for me to realize that. And the second was that I realized for the first time in my life why so many things had happened to me, because I had been born a female in a Muslim society. So that event, that initial study of the Quran changed my whole life, because I felt compelled to continue this study, to find out what had happened. How is it that there's such a big discrepancy between Quranic teaching and Muslim practice, and so on? So I spent the next 10 years, from 1974 to 1983-84, doing that study of the Quran from every aspect related to women. Women in terms of their roles, woman as wife, as mother, as daughter, as a person, as a businesswoman, and so on. And this was a very personal study for me. I wasn't doing it to get tenure or anything else. It didn't have really that kind of motivation. But it had become extremely important for me to study this and to share what I was learning with other Muslim women. Okay. And then when I began this study, which has continued over the last 47 years, the first problem that I became aware of was that the sources of Islam, all religions have multiple sources, and Islam has also 4 main sources, of which the first 2 are regarded as the most important. The highest, of course, is the Quran, which Muslims believe to be God's word, revealed through the agency of Archangel Gabriel to Prophet Muhammad, who was born in 570 year of the Christian era, and he had received prophethood at the age of 40, which would be 610 CE. So the highest source of authority in Islam is the Quran. And then the next one is the life of the Prophet, which consists of two parts. There is the Sunnah, which is the Prophet's lived life, his experiences in life practically, and Hadith. Now, Hadith are oral traditions that are attributed to him, and there are millions of them. And we run into a lot of issues of how to figure out the authenticity of traditions. But anyway, let's go back to the Quran, which is the primary source of Islam. So the problem that I encountered was that it's the interpretations that I was coming across were obviously very much affected by culture. Let me stop here for a minute and go back to a general observation. All the 5 major religions of the world, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism, developed in patriarchal cultures. See, when a religion appears, it doesn't fall from heaven to earth. It's filtered through many layers of culture and subculture. So eventually what you experience is not the religion that was revealed sent by God, but it has already accumulated a lot of cultural layers of meaning and understanding. And so I want to mention one more thing, which is historically important. We can talk about it later on also, that I mentioned that one of the sources, normative sources, is what is called Hadith. These are the spoken oral traditions attributed to the Prophet. And I can tell you a little bit more about the origin of it at sometime today, but right now I just want to say that this was, when the Muslims started to go out of Arabia, the Prophet established the first Islamic state in Medina in 622 CE. And by the time that he passed away in 632 CE, Muslims had already left the borders of Arabia and they were going in all directions. When these Muslims went, say, to Persia or to Egypt and Palestine and so on, they were coming into contact with civilizations that were much more advanced than theirs, because there was no civilization in Arabia at the time of Islam. Arabia was a land inhabited by nomadic tribes, because the vast majority of Arabia is desert. And these nomadic tribes lived in the desert. And, there was a lot of tribal warfare going on. So there was no consolidated government or anything. Anyhow, the Prophet organized the warring tribes of Medina, and he set up the first Islamic society. And so anyhow, when these Muslims were going to other countries, many of them much more advanced than they were, and they ran into any problem. It could be an administrative problem or social problem, whatever. They felt that they had 2 resources to turn to. The first was the Quran. They would look for the solution in the Quran. And the second was the life of the Prophet, because they lived very close to the time of the Prophet. And they would say, well, if the Prophet had been here, what would he have done? And so that led to a very frantic search for the words of the prophet. And within 100 years, there were millions of these traditions that had come. So the scholars of that time were very concerned about that. And they said, how are we going to determine in later times what is authentic saying of the prophet and what is not? The greatest of the Hadith scholars is called Imam Bukhari. And he knew about 2 million Hadiths. He examined more than 60,000 of them. Examined meaning, this was pre-Google days, so he traveling from place to place to find out who were these narrators of the Hadith and so on. And then he authenticated less than 3,000. So what that meant is that the vast majority of the Hadiths were inauthentic. However, the science of Hadith was the first discipline to develop in Islam. So by the time we come to the first century of Islam, the Hadith discipline is very much in place. The question arises, if the Hadiths were not, the vast majority of Hadiths were not the words of the Prophet, then what were they? Well, they were a picture of Arab culture. They depicted Arab culture, what it stood for. And because this was the first discipline to appear in Islam, and the discipline of the interpretation of the Quran, which is called tafsir, developed afterwards, that the Hadith became the lens through which the Quran was read. And that is true from this day to today, that the Hadith literature has had profound influence on the interpretation of the Quran. So my first task, when I started to try to understand what the Quran was saying, was how am I going to do it? What are my principles of interpretation, my hermeneutics? Because I had no model before me. Nobody had done this before. So I knew one thing is I was not going to do a patriarchal interpretation of the Quran. I knew that very early on, that the Quran was not patriarchal. And so interpreting it from a patriarchal point of view was going to lead to many misreadings and misunderstandings. So then the first challenge for me was to develop my own principles of interpretation. And I developed 3. The first one I call linguistic accuracy, because the Quran was revealed in the 7th century in the area of Arabia called Hijaz, where we have Mecca and Medina. And so what did the words of the Quran mean at that time in the area in which it was revealed? Because words also have a history. Words change their meaning over time. So what did these words mean then? Number one. Second is philosophical consistency. Because you find, for example, there are words like the word Adam, used 25 times in the Quran. 21 times it is used as a generic term for humanity. It's not the name of a person. And 4 times it's used as the name of a person. So if you want to know what does Adam mean in the Quran, you have to look at all the 25 contexts before you can answer that question. Okay. So anyway, getting back to my principles of interpretation. So the first one was linguistic accuracy. The second one was philosophical consistency. And the third one, I call that the ethical criterion. And let me explain that to you. Muslims believe that the Quran is the literal word of God. Okay? This is a fundamental Muslim belief. Okay? They believe that it is the literal word of God. Okay. They also believe that the Quran is the final revelation of God. Okay. The Quran tells us that God has many names. you might have heard of the 99 names of God. Perhaps there are even more than that. But one of the most important attributes of God is adil, or God is just, justice of God. So when I'm looking at the Quran, I'm trying to understand the Quran, and I believe this is the word of God, then surely the Quran must reflect the attributes of God. It must reflect the justice of God, because it's God's word. But if I find that the interpretation, the way the words of the Quran have been interpreted, are manifestly unjust, they cannot be then the true interpretation of the Quran, because God is by definition just. And God, God, the Quran is the final revelation for Muslims, but God is over and beyond the Quran. God is the author of the Quran. To understand the Quran, you have to have some understanding of what God is and what is God's intention. And so my third criterion of interpretation is what I call the ethical criterion, is justice. Is this interpretation just or not just? So I started with those tools, and the first phase of my life, of my study, was 10 years, in which I became absolutely and totally satisfied, not only that the Quran does not discriminate against women, but that the Quran is very, very protective of women's rights. And it is protective of women's rights because the Quran, like the Bible, is protective of the rights of the disadvantaged people in society, the widows, the orphans, the infirm, the people who are imprisoned, the people who are old, and so on. Very deep level of concern in the Quran for people who are disadvantaged, who are not given their rights, in the marginalized in some way. During those 10 years, I wrote quite a bit. In fact, I wrote one of my earliest books was a book called Women, Islamic View of Women, which was the Quranic view of women. And I spoke at different places. One thing that I want to share with you, which is not directly concerned with my work on women, but it is very much a part of my life. And the two areas, the two main passions that I had in life are kind of intertwined, interconnected, is that in 1979, I had been invited to become a part of the first Jewish Christian Muslim dialogue that existed in the United States. It was under the sponsorship of the Kennedy Institute of Ethics in Washington, D.C., sponsored by Mr. Sergeant Shriver, who was the brother-in-law of John Kennedy, who was the president of the institute. And a number of scholars had been summoned, about 10 Jewish scholars and 10 Christian scholars, and there were just 2 Muslims in that. But anyhow, Mr. Shriver believed that he wanted to bring together these scholars so that they could look at the commonalities. And his personal interest was in finding a peace solution to the Middle East problem, Arab-Israeli problem. But he thought that it was a time to bring together scholars from these 3 traditions. So I became a part of that. And so, my experience in interreligious dialogue also goes all the way back. And they are intertwined in many ways, as perhaps would become evident as we go on to talk about some details. Okay, so as I say, I've already said, my main reason for undertaking this study was to make sense of my own life as a Muslim woman. That was very important to me. And 10 years of my life, I was absolutely satisfied that this book does not discriminate against me. This book is my biggest tool of liberation. And this is something I wanted to share with Muslim women. Okay. So then 1983-84 starts the second phase of my own development in this area. 1979 saw one of the most important events in Muslim history, and that was the Iranian Revolution. Because in Iran, a country that was considered to be the bulwark of Western friendship, very much an ally of the United States, the Shah was overturned by the revolution that made Ayatollah Khomeini the head of the country. It was an amazing revolution that took place, and it took the world by surprise. It had many repercussions, but I just want to talk about a couple of them that intersect with my life's work. After the Iranian Revolution, the Iranian Revolution took the world by surprise. There were two superpowers at that time. There was the United States and there was the USSR. And they were both very shocked by this for different reasons. And they were very concerned that the revolution in Iran might spill over into other countries and other Muslim countries. All of the Eastern republics of the Soviet Union were Islamic. And they were very scared that it might get there. And so what they did is they installed direct rule, Russian rule in Afghanistan, which led to 10 years of Afghans fighting, the Mujahideen fighting the Soviets. So the one superpower reacted that way. The other superpower, America, built bases all around that area. There are hundreds of American bases there. So this is happening. And then I used to go to Pakistan every year to spend time with my mother. But in 83, 84, I happened to spend 2 entire years in Pakistan because I had a year's sabbatical leave, and I had a fellowship, a research fellowship for a year. So I was there for 2 years. And something very, very important was happening in Pakistan and in some other Muslim countries also. In Pakistan, this process was called Islamization. And what does Islamization mean? Islamization means the promulgation of laws that are meant to make society more Muslim. Now, keep in mind that this is a Muslim country. Pakistan was the only country in the world that was created in the name of Islam. So it's already Muslim, but the presumption is that it's not Muslim enough, and so we should make it more Muslim. I mean, this is the impact of the Iranian Revolution on a number of countries. So they started this process of what is called Islamization of laws. So when I was in Pakistan at that time, this process had already started. Very shortly, actually, after the Iranian Revolution, this process started in Pakistan. And one of the first laws that was instituted by the then president of Pakistan, who was a military leader, General Ziaul Haq, it was called the Hadood Ordinances. The word had in Arabic means it's a limit. Had crimes are the fundamental crimes in Islam. And so these are many, many ordinances. But one of them is called the Zina Ordinance. Zina means sex outside of marriage. It can mean adultery, it can mean fornication, but zina is this ordinance covers zina. And it says that anybody who is proven guilty of zina should be stoned to death. Now, this is quite amazing because stoning to death is not mentioned anywhere in the Quran. It was not an Islamic punishment. It had existed in Jewish law, but had been outlawed by Christianity. When Jesus had said, let him throw the first stone who himself is without guilt. So it was resurrected from the past and brought back and said, Rajam, stoning to death. So at that time, this obviously generated a lot of concern amongst the women groups. There was no organized women's movement in Pakistan at that time. There were the only women who were in some sort of a leadership position were women who were highly secular and highly westernized. But they began to see that this law and subsequent laws that were going to come, which I will refer to later on, that they were going to affect every woman potentially. So they formed an organization. It was sort of like a group called the Women's Action Forum. That was the first group that emerged. Pakistan was under martial law, so no political activity was allowed. So you couldn't go out into the streets or do anything like that. But anyhow, these women were brave women, and they did whatever they could. They had some press conferences, and they incurred some punishment also, but they wanted to raise public consciousness. So in the summer of 1984, when I was observing all this development and getting very concerned, I was approached by some of my women activist friends, because this was all happening in Lahore. And so they came to me and they said, you have been studying this subject for many years, so you know something about this. So would you help us? Because law after law is coming in the name of Islam, and we don't know how to counter it because we don't know anything about Islam in a scholarly sense. So would you consider helping? So this was, another turning point in my life. The first one had come in 1974 when I had gotten into the study almost accidentally at Stillwater. And now when I heard these women talking to me, is basically they were asking me to come up with a liberation theology for women, something that women could use to fight against these laws. And I had no doubt that I wanted to be helpful, but I had to do a lot of rethinking, because it's one thing to do a study for yourself and another thing to become the ideologue of a movement. It was a very different situation. So I spent the summer of 1984 doing a lot of reading and doing a lot of reflection. And what was I reading? Well, I read many things. I read the two major hadith collections in Islam, Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim. I read the works of many of the Western Christian and Jewish feminist theologians, because feminist theology had started in the United States in 1960. But there were important writings like Rosemary Ruther and Mary Daly and Phyllis Tribble, who were looking at the biblical text from a non-patriarchal point of view. That's what they were doing. And so, and again, as I said, I had been involved in this interreligious dialogue since 1979 also. So I had some knowledge of it. And beyond that, when I started my education, I studied in an Anglican missionary school in Pakistan before I went to study in England. So I had actually a lot of exposure to Christianity in my growing years. So anyway, so I thought about that, about how to go about it. How does one counter this whole movement, which is meant to make women less than fully human? Okay, so at the end of the summer, I identified 3 basic or fundamental theological assumptions which underlie the discrimination against women in all the 3 traditions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Let me explain this to you. The first assumption has to do with the creation of woman. The book of Genesis, which is the first book of the Bible, has 2 creation stories. One in chapter 1, verses 26, 27, second in chapter 2, verses 18 to 24. And the two stories are completely different. In the first story, it says, and God created Adam and made him male and female, and God gave them dominion over the earth and so on. So it's talking about human creation in egalitarian terms, not in hierarchical terms, but egalitarian terms. The second story is the famous rib story. And the rib story was that God created Adam. God created everything else also in pairs, but Adam was alone, and Adam was lonely. So God put him to sleep one day, and took a rib from his side, and made it into a woman. And when Adam awoke, he saw her. He was overjoyed, and he said, "Bone of my bone thou art, flesh of my flesh thou art, and I shall never be parted from you." So this is the famous rib story. So this is in chapter 2. We know a lot more now about how the Bible was put together than people in earlier ages. And a lot of these stories have been dated. We do not know the names of many of the writers of different portions of the Bible, but some of them are referred to by code words or code names. So the first story, which is the egalitarian story in Genesis chapter 1, is attributed to the writer who's known as the priestly writer. And the story is dated the 5th century BCE. The second story, the rib story, is attributed to another writer who was called the Yahwist. That's just a code name, not a real name. And this story was dated the 10th century BCE. So actually the rib story is 500 years older than the other story, even though it's put second in the Bible. Anyway, that was just a little bit of history. So the first theological assumption is that God's primary creation was Adam, that Adam was a male person, and that from the rib of this male person, a female was derived, so that woman is secondary and derivative and inferior and subordinate. This is how this story has been interpreted. This is the story of creation. The second assumption is that though a woman was secondary in creation, she was primary in guilt because she got poor Adam thrown out of paradise. I'm sure you know that story. And therefore, women are not to be trusted. They are temptresses, seductresses, unreliable, not to be trusted. And the whole baggage of feminine evil is tied up with that story. The third assumption was that not only was woman created from Adam, but woman was created for Adam. This is again coming from Genesis 3, which says, and woman was created to be the helpmate of Adam. Now, it's on these three stories, these three assumptions, that the entire hierarchy of this belief system that men are superior to women is built in the three traditions. These stories this hierarchy was developed first and foremost in the Christian tradition. And it's very manifest if you read through the New Testament, that like St. Paul, writing in a letter to the Corinthians, he talks about a hierarchy. And, God, it's like there's God, there's Jesus Christ, there's man, there's woman. There's a hierarchy in which creation took place. And that hierarchy must always be observed. And woman is always at the bottom. So, and then he says, I do not allow a woman to pray or prophesy with her head uncovered. A woman must cover her head because she's made in the image of man, and man is made in the image of God. So man must not cover his head. And if a woman will not cover her head, she has to have her head shaved off, which was a statement that she was a harlot. And and the reason that's given again and again and again in these passages is for woman came from man, not man from woman. If you look at it, think for a minute, do women come from men or do men come from women? common sense question. But anyhow, theology doesn't always go that way. So these stories came out of the Christian tradition, and they impacted both the Jewish tradition, which was earlier, and the Islamic tradition, which was later. But it happened. You know, I have done this pop quiz all over the Islamic world in front of all sorts of audiences, you know, students, lawyers, and journalists, and writers, and so on. And I do a pop quiz, and I said, how was woman created? These are Muslim audiences. And the answer comes back without the blinking of an eyelid, from the rib of Adam. So I said, oh, I see. So you've been reading Genesis, because this story is not present at all in the Quran. There's no rib story. But that has become a part of the tradition. So anyway, I identified these three as the basic source of the inequality of the hierarchy that exists. And then I researched into each of them. Now, my friends, the activists who had asked me in the beginning to help them to come up with a theology that they could use, would come back to me from time to time and say, well, you know, how far along are you? You know, have you come up with something, or are you still talking about Adam and Eve? And I said, unfortunately, I'm still talking about Adam and Eve. And they didn't quite understand what I was doing. But I tried to explain it to them. One of my Quranic teachers told me a metaphor. I don't remember even the context, but I remember the metaphor. He said to me, if you are in a train and you're going in a certain direction, and for some reason, the train is derailed, gets off track, and starts going in some other direction, and you realize that, you can't immediately take that train and put it back on the right track. You have to stop the train, you have to take it back to the point of origin, and then you put it on the right track. So you have to take it back to the point of origin. That's what women have to do, because women got derailed at the point of creation. So you have to go back to the point of creation and set the record right. So the first phase of my life was self-study, exploration, and the second phase, which started in 1984, was, I developed this theology, and I traveled very extensively in the Muslim world, all the way from Turkey to Indonesia, and I wanted to share what I had learned. I'm happy to say that when I started this work in 1974, there was not anybody in the world doing this work. And now there are many, and it makes me very happy that now there are many women and even men who are studying feminist theology in Islam. So that's very gratifying to me. Okay, so then what's the next step? So I continued with my research continues. So, anybody who's a research scholar knows research never ends. So that continued, goes on. But I began, my concern was with making a difference on the ground. During the course of these 10 years, certainly 84 onwards, I identified myself as an activist. I was a theologian by training, but I was an activist by choice. It was extremely important for me to make a difference on the ground. Okay, one or two other things I want to mention belonging to this period of time is that, 1984 onwards, that there was a tremendous increase in violence against women after the Hadood laws, and these laws were coming into being. And in 1999, the BBC made a film called Murder in Parda. Parda means in secret. And it was about honor crimes in Pakistan. It was a very graphic film, very, very hard film to watch. Women being burnt alive and lots of terrible things happening to women. And the film was made in BBC, and it evoked a lot of reactions, especially from Pakistanis. Pakistanis are the largest minority group in England. So they protested very much against it, said this is all British propaganda, it doesn't happen, and so on. And then the film came a month later to the United States, and it was shown on Newsline. And the American ABC, they invited two women to become commentators on it. One was Asma Jahangir, who was a lawyer from Pakistan, and I was the other one. And they wanted us to comment on this film. Well, I had to answer the questions, not even having seen the film. I hadn't seen the film. In fact, I had just come back from Holland the night before, and I was invited to participate in this, and I did. So the questions that I was answering were really academic questions. It was not, I hadn't seen the film. But I became very involved in that because, you know, after that, in that program, I was asked, well, what do you think? You know, why are these people treating their women so badly? Why are they killing these daughters and wives and so on? And what is it in Islam that sanctions it? And I said, this is not Islamic. There's nothing in Islam that sanctions it. This is patriarchal culture, what I've told you. And so, you know, but this commentator was very adamant on linking it to Islam. And I kept saying, no, this is not Islam. This is culture. Anyway, after that program ended, that program used to air at like 12 o'clock at night. After it ended, I started to receive messages, email and phone and fax and so on from many people, mostly either American women or South Asian students who had seen the program. And they said, well, you know, you took the stand. This is not Islamic, and what can we do? Can we do something to change the situation? So I thought at that point, yes, we can try to do something. So I formed what you might call a support group, you know, like an internet support group. And it started with a few hundred people. And in about 3 months, there were thousands of people. That's the nature of the internet, of email. And there were people who had joined this as far away as Fiji, as Australia, as England, all over the world. People wanted to join this movement against honor crimes. So in 1999, I set up an organization in Pakistan called the International Network for the Rights of Female Victims of Violence in Pakistan. And as I said, there were many, many people. And then in the year 2000, I had the opportunity to take my case to President Musharraf, who was the president of Pakistan, also a military ruler. And I told him what I thought, and you know, and he was at that time, this is the first phase of his political life, was a progressive person, and he wanted to bring about some kind of enlightenment. And so in the year 2000, there was a conference on human rights in Islam for the very first time in Pakistan. And at that conference, he said, you know, honor crimes are against Islam and they are prohibited by Pakistani law and so on. So my point in saying that is that our advocacy did lead to positive results in some way. Although Pakistan still remains the world's worst offender in honor crimes, more honor crimes committed in Pakistan than in all the rest of the world put together. It's still a very bad situation, but at least we brought awareness to it and some relief for some people who are victims of it. Okay, so getting beyond that, my concern was that I wanted to reach, you know, as I said, I was traveling, I was teaching what I had learned, but my concern was that the vast majority of Muslim women, if there are 1.8 billion Muslims in the world, at least 50% of them are Muslim women, maybe more than that. And the vast majority of these women have three characteristics. They are illiterate, they are poor, and they live in a village. And they don't have any access to any kind of education or healthcare, etc. Their situation is extremely dire. And these are not the women who come to my conferences or my classes, or I have no way to reach them. And this was very important to me, that these women who are the worst sufferers of the injustice have to be educated. And so I devised in the 90s a training program. And I started training groups of people, social justice workers, social work people. I mean, there are these people who work in these different departments, government departments mainly, but they will go and work in villages. So because I can't go and work in a village, I wanted to educate these people, both men and women, so that they could go and they could educate people at the grassroots level. So I've done several of these, not enough, obviously, but you need a lot of financial backing for that, and that it has not been forthcoming. But I have had the opportunity to train a number of people, including in 2010, a delegation from Afghanistan. And in this delegation, there were 6 ulama, religious leaders with long beards, and there were some women who were feminists and some men who were working in UN organizations related to women, like UNIFEM and so on. So I did, long training session with them on all the issues of women, all of them. And so that was a great experience in a sense for me. Initially, I was very nervous because I thought that these ulama are going to be very upset with me with my interpretations, but I was quite astonished to see that they were not. They disagreed with some of my interpretations. Like when I say Adam was not a man, because the word Adam is a Hebrew word, comes from the root word Adama, which means the earth. So the word Adam, as it occurs in the Hebrew Bible, means a human being, an earth creature. And that's what the word means in the Quran also. It's not the name of a male person. Anyway, so, but they liked what I did because they had a very strong commitment to social justice. And they thought that what I was giving them an understanding of Islam that was very heavily in favor of social justice. So they were pleased with it. So I think I've sort of kind of given you an overview of important things. I mean, this is just a very bare narrative of lots of things that had happened. So I think what I would like to do is to stop here for a minute and give you a chance to think, and perhaps you can tell me now if you have any questions. I asked you at the very beginning, and that was not the right time, I guess. What about now?
Well, thank you very much, Riffat, for all that information. I have a feeling people are doing some deep thinking about all of the things that you have said, and I'll kind of kick things off. I've noted a number of questions have come up via chat that I'll relay to you.
Okay.
You mentioned that your complimentary of the Quran and its truthfulness and your interpretation of it as it regards women. So is there anything in the Quran related to women's issues that disturbs you or maybe even runs counter to your beliefs as a Muslim?
No, not now. When I got started, I didn't know enough, but the Quran is very supportive of women's rights, and you can name any issue and we can talk about it. It's interesting. Before I came to this session, I did a recording for a BBC radio program and they were interviewing a woman teacher from Kabul and myself, and talking about, what does the Quran say about women's education, and what the Taliban are saying about women's education. We will let them go to school provided they work within the Islamic law and Sharia. What do you think about that? We had a discussion on that just before I came on to this program. The Quran, Ron, as I'm sure you know, is a complex text. And understanding the Quran is not so simple. It's taken me so many years, so many decades. But I believe that the paramount concern of the Quran is to uplift women, to strengthen it. There's a recognition in the Quran that women were at the lowest level of society. In Arabia at the time of the Prophet, female infanticide was being practiced. Female children were killed at birth. And women were bought and sold. Women did not have any rights. If you start from there, that was the situation, and you end during the Prophet's time in Medina, the 10 years. Look at the rights that he gave to women. It's unbelievable. He said, "I learn half of the faith from me, learn half of it from Aisha." Aisha was his wife, who has narrated more than 2,000 hadiths. Great scholar, young woman, great scholar, and so many incidents from the Prophet's life of how he uplifted women. And the Quran, this program that was just this BBC program was asked me about, what does the Quran say about women's education? I said the starting point in the Quran is that God created Adam, meaning both men and women, to be God's vicegerent on earth, to be Khalifatul Earth. God created human beings as the stewards of the world to establish just order. God gave human beings the highest of all capabilities, and that is the use of reason, rational faculty, and freedom of will. And the Quran says that human beings have the capability to rise to the highest and to sink to the lowest. In order to develop all your capabilities as a human being, to develop all the God-given gifts you've been given, the first and foremost thing, aside of course from Iman, which is belief in God, is education. God is described 157 times in the Quran as Al-Alim, one who has knowledge. So the gaining of knowledge is extremely critical, because without knowledge, you cannot understand either the outer world or the inner world. So, there are so many verses that come to my mind when I think of education. And so, so that's where I stand. But again, when you see something like the Taliban saying, we are going to give women according to the Islamic Sharia, and they don't know their Islam is certainly not the Islam that I'm aware of, and they have no idea what the Sharia means. A lot of people in this country think Sharia is a body of law, and it's not. Sharia doesn't mean law. Sharia, the word Sharia means, it means a path that leads to running water where human beings and animals come to drink water in safety. It's a general word, and it refers to the Islamic way of life. And the purpose of the Sharia is to make life easy, not to make life hard. It's been totally turned around and made into something highly punitive. So, Ron, so many things have gone wrong with how Muslims have understood Islam, and that you don't know where to start and where to end. But personally, if you say, have I found anything? No, I haven't found anything. There are some Quranic verses that are very difficult to interpret. And some of them took me many, many years to really understand. Not easy. But that is, if you were asking me today, do I think there's anything in the Quran? No, there is not.
Well, one of those verses, Dr. Hassan, might be the one that's been often repeated by critics of Islam, having to do with a man's permission to the term used is beat his wife.
Yeah, I know that is a complex verse. Yeah, it's chapter 4, Surah An-Nisa, verse 34. And you're right, a lot has been made of that verse, and that verse has been used against women, against Muslim women in many contexts, including legal contexts. And it's, it's a complex verse. It's not one problem, Ron, that happens, and it happens with the Quran a lot. It happens also with other scriptures, that people take one line out of a text and say, this is what it is. This is a complex verse. It starts by saying, men are given ar-rijal qawwamun al-nisa. Men have been given a certain responsibility towards women in a certain context. If I were to just tell you in in a simple narrative what this verse is about, I would say this: the Quran recognizes that there's division of function in society. It's necessary, because only women can give birth. Men do not give birth. So the thrust of this verse is that when women are in the process of childbearing and child rearing, they must be supported by the men. And the word used is not husband. The word husband is not used in this verse at all. The word used is rijal. Rijal means men. That when women are performing this function, men, whether any man, husband, brother, whoever, must support women in this situation. Then the second part of it is, and supposing that there are women who, the word is nushuz. Nushuz is a word that signifies some kind of rebellion against God. That supposing that there comes a time a moment in time when women said, we will not have children, because this is division created by God, that only women can have children and men don't have children. If it should happen that women say no, nushuz means rebellion. It's sort of organized rebellion. They say no, we will not. And so then what is society to do? Again, let me mention an important grammatical point in this whole passage. There are Quranic verses in which the context is, or the Quran is talking to only men and women, husband, wife, men and women. And then there are verses in which the Quran is not talking to husband and wife, it's talking to the community. And it uses not the singular for one, not the dual for two, but plural. So this entire verse is in plural form. It's not addressed to men and women, it's addressed to the Muslim community. And that's what it says, that if women are in need of help during childbirth or child rearing, the community has to support them. And then it says, so if should it happen that these women are rebellious, they say no. And this is not rebellion against them, it's rebellion against God, because God has given them the capability of bearing children. And if they refuse for no reason at all, of course, if they refuse for health reasons or something else, that's different. But if they say no, then what is the community to do? And there are 3 steps. The first is talk to them. That's the first thing. If they're taking a position, talk to find out. The second one is, okay, after you've talked to them, then leave them alone for a while, let them reflect. And if they don't change their positions, then leave them alone for a longer period of time. This verse, that line you were referring to, beat them, zarabuhunna, another important point to note is that every Arabic word has multiple meanings. If Arabic, to understand how the Arabic language works, you have to think of a tree. A tree has a trunk and leaves and branches, and it has roots. If you look at the roots of the trees, they go in many directions. There are multiple roots. So Arabic works like that. Every word has multiple meanings. And so one meaning of the word may be to beat, but there are many other meanings. And another meaning of it is to leave them alone for a longer time. Not, first for a short time, then for a longer time. Now, you might say, well, that's not going to happen. Women are not going to say, oh, we're not going to have children. That's precisely what happened in the 1960s. There was a whole movement, the ultra-radical feminist movement, if you know anything about it, that came from California. Precisely this, patriarchy is bad, men are bastards, we're not going to have children. I have worked with some of these women who were in this movement, so it happened. So it's just saying that, there's a law, there's an order of existence created by God, division of labor, men and women. Men do this, they support each other. But if women, for some reason, don't want to abide, then leave them alone, not beat them, leave them alone, confine them for a longer time. And this, again, the Quran, they say the best interpretation of the Quran is itself, because one word that occurs here is going to occur in other places. And then you can see what does that mean? And so there is this idea, this rule in the Quran, or this exhortation in the Quran, that if there is something evil going on in the world, like fitna, this uses the word fitna, which is harmful to society. If people are, say, they are selling poison, or they are doing something that's harmful to society, you should confine them. Don't give them free rein. Don't let them go anywhere. Confine them. So confinement is also a form of behavior. So, that's it. In this context, I would like to refer you to a scholar by the name of Dr. John Andrew Morrow. He is a scholar who has done an amazing amount of work. For many, many, many years, he has worked on what are called the covenants of the prophet. He discovered 100 or more covenants that the prophet had made with people of different religions, in which he promised them his personal protection. These documents are unparalleled in world history. And, he's the founder of all that. But he also has written an entire book. It's about 400 pages on this one verse that you're talking about. So, and he refutes it word by word, that this is not what it means that people say it means. So there is that literature that is also available in case people are interested in going into that.
Now you have quite a knowledge of Christianity as well as Islam and probably Judaism as well. But we had a question from one of our participants. Sure. What do you make of Jesus and his relationship to women, and maybe draw a comparison or contrast with the way Muhammad treated women?
Well, Jesus was a feminist. The stories of Jesus that are known, that he was always protective of women, and he had very devoted female disciples. So, their role in the world was different. I mean, Jesus was crucified at the age of 33, and Prophet Muhammad died at the age of 63, but Prophet Muhammad, at a longer time, he established a state, he established a society. So their lives don't exactly overlap, but this thing is common to them for sure, that they were both feminists. They both believed very strongly in the rights of women. And one more point I want to make, which somebody might not ask, that the only woman named in the Quran is the Blessed Mary, called Maryam in the Quran. There's an entire chapter in the Quran named after her, the mother of Jesus, and her piety and her devotion to God. And she is named as the highest woman ever created. Tremendous honor given to Mary. And this is a very, very strong link between Islam and Christianity, particularly Catholicism, which is very Mary-centered. But a lot of people don't know that. So.
We are going to open microphones and video in about 10 minutes, Dr. Hassan, to let our participants communicate with you directly. But and until that time, another question or two. What Muslim country today do you feel best represents the correct interpretation of the Quran as it regards women?
I can't think of any country that is really living up to the standards set by the Quran. there are levels. I mean, some are, I don't see any country, Muslim country, that really recognizes the equality of men and women. But there are differences in terms of what rights they recognize. I mean, some countries, women have greater access to the legal system, to some sort of a justice system, and so on, and some they have none. At this point, perhaps you can put Afghanistan at one end of it. And on the other hand, I mean, like, for instance, in some ways, Malaysia was enlightened, in some ways, not perfectly. Turkey in some ways, Egypt in some ways, but not, I mean, I can't think of any current Muslim society that represents really the spirit of the Quran entirely. But some are a little bit more advanced than others. That's all I can say.
So what is
I want to add one more thing though, Ron, that people say, this is a very positive thing. When they say, when you look at women leaders in the world, you know how many women leaders the Muslim world has had who are women? Today, there are 13 Muslim countries that have women leaders, 13, not just Pakistan and Bangladesh and Indonesia. There are 13, several in Africa, Mali and then Kosovo and so on. I can't remember all of them off the top of my head, but there were 13. There are 13 countries which have Muslim women leaders. This is something very extraordinary.
So what is the roadblock for many of these countries? Is it just a men's problem or what?
Why don't women in America get the same wage for the same work? I mean, this is a very patriarchal country, and women are not equal to men in so many ways. It's the whole way through, all the way through. I can't think of any country in the world where women and men are treated equal. So, roadblock is patriarchy. And in some cases, coupled with other things, like in Pakistan, feudalism and tribalism. In Afghanistan, it's a tribal society. So there are other complicating factors. But I don't know of any country where men and women have been given the rights, or women have acquired the rights that they deserve. They're not equal anywhere that I know of.
You have studied this issue for decades. So are you in the position to say there's been any improvement over, let's say, the last 50 years in the understanding of the way Islam, your interpretation, the way Islam is understood as it relates to women?
Yes. I'm happy to answer that question. I've seen a tremendous change. As I have said a while ago, when I started doing this work in feminist theology, I was the only one doing it. And now there are so many. And they are from several countries. And they are also men who are writing about it. So it's changed a lot. Also, at the level of ground reality. If you travel from Saudi Arabia, where women are supposed to be highly repressed, and go all the way to Indonesia, what you will find at the grassroots level, that the most dynamic groups that you will find are women's groups. They may be sometimes small, but they are doing everything from economic empowerment projects, health projects, education, cottage industries, name it. Every kind of work is being done by Muslim women, and they are very vital. Even in Saudi Arabia, where they have a lot of restrictions, if the women are activists. I was invited to Saudi Arabia one time, which was very surprising. They don't invite women to conferences, but I got invited because the Saudi ambassador in Pakistan was a good friend of mine. But I had this amazing experience of it was conference on human rights, and women were not allowed to sit in the lobby. Women were relegated to the upstairs where they were invisible, and I sat there, and all around me, I saw these Saudi women. They were dressed, all covered up and so on. So nobody said anything. And then came the break, and we went into a back room. And these same women who had been sitting there totally silent, they're taken off their garbs and their veils and all that. And I discovered one is a psychiatrist, one is a journalist, one is a lawyer, and they were, full of anger. And they said, this is nonsense. We're sitting in this conference and we are not allowed to talk. And I was amazed to see that this is, and this journalist was sitting down and typing all this in an article. So underneath the surface, a lot of movement. So I think there's a lot of dynamism in women's movements throughout the Islamic world. That gives me hope.
Now, I have noticed throughout the course of your presentation, Dr. Hassan, that, and I'm sure participants have also noticed that you're a Muslim woman who doesn't cover her hair. Mm-hmm. So that it's not just a personal observation, but it's an Islamic observation, because many Muslims believe women should cover their hair. So what does the Quran say about the dress, the proper dress for a woman and the proper dress for a man?
Okay, all right. Well, let's start with the Quran first. Is that the law in the Quran is, I would call it the law of modesty, applies to both men and women. It's in Surah 24, and it says, say to the believing men that they should lower their gaze and not stare at women. And then it says, say to the believing women that they should lower their gaze and not stare at men, starting with the women, meaning Muslims, men and women must behave modestly in society. So that's equally applicable. Okay, now let's look at some other verses, like, let me see if I have context here, is that, see, at that time, at the time of the Prophet, at the time of the revelation of the Quran, as I said, women were at the bottom, where female infanticide was being practiced. And I'm just looking for a couple of references here for you. There's this verse, for instance, that is often quoted. And this is Surah 33, Al-Ahzab. We said, O Prophet, tell thy wives and daughters and the believing women that they should cast their outer garments over their persons when abroad. That is most convenient, that they should be known as such and not molested. Okay, what is the background of this? Background of this is that at the time of the rise of Islam, majority of Arab women went about bare-breasted. Their breasts were not covered. Okay, so in the verse that I quoted earlier, Surah 24, is that they should cover themselves. And here it's saying, O Prophet, tell thy wives and daughters and the believing women, this is for all women, including the Prophet's wives, that they should cast their outer garment. No, jilbab. What is an outer garment? It's like a robe. It's like a robe that a priest might wear on top of his dress. Because if women didn't wear that and they went out, they could be taken as street women and molested. It says it in the verse. They should cover themselves by their outer garments, which means that it will declare to people that I'm a Muslim woman, leave me alone in peace, so that they should not be molested. That's the reason. Now today, in today's world, that is no longer the case. That in order that if I don't wear a jilbab, I'm going to be molested. That's not the case. It doesn't apply anymore. That was for that time. So it's, there are two kinds of legislations, Ron. There is what you might call restrictive, and there's protective. Restrictive is when you limit somebody or something, say you can't do it. Protective is when you enable some. The Quran wants women to go out. The Quran wants women to go about their business, but they should dress in such a way that they are protected from being attacked, because they lived in that society when these things were happening. You know, I come from Pakistan. I come from Lahore, which is a very educated, cultured city. But there are parts of that city where I wouldn't go dressed the way I dress here. Many years ago, I had a friend who was professor at the University of Prague in Czechoslovakia. He and his wife were both Islamicists. The wife was an art historian. And they came to Pakistan, and I was showing them around, and she wanted to go to the old city and see the architecture. And so I said, fine. So, you know, she was a very tall woman, and she was wearing a mini skirt. And so I accompanied her. So we went to this old city, which is very narrow, and then, you know, very, very tall houses. And, you know, so we walked in, and all of a sudden, you know, there were thousands of people looking at her, you know, looking from the balcony, looking from here and there. And it was like a whole crowd. We had hardly gone 10, 15 steps. So then immediately we returned. We went back to the car. And the next time, you know, had a sobering impact on her. And now a few days later, she says, I want to go back, but can I borrow your clothes? Because I can't go like that. I can't go there dressed in a miniskirt. So the thing is that it's I'm wearing this shawl, which is like a dupatta or whatever you want to call it, and it's my choice if I want to put it on my head or if I don't. You know, if I were going to a mosque, I would put it on my head. If I were in the company of some you know, older relatives or people that I respect, I would put it on my head. And so I'm not bound to do one thing or the other thing. It is not required of me in this day and age that I must. But it's interesting, you know, in 1995, I was a plenary speaker at Beijing, the fourth conference, UN conference on women. And I had about 15 minutes. I mean, that was an international gathering, the largest conference the world had ever had until that time. And and at that conference, there was a very huge collection of women, all dressed in black, extremely conservative, from Saudi Arabia and Sudan mainly. And so I debated it in my head. I said, you know, if I'm going to go speak there and everybody's going to be watching me, what should I do? Should I cover my head or should I not cover my head? And I decided to cover my head for the simple reason that I wanted people to hear what I had to say. Instead of just saying, oh, she hasn't covered her head, she hasn't covered her head. I wanted them to hear my argument. So I did. So I choose my discretion. If I think I need to do it, I do it. I'm not bound either way. It makes, I mean, by putting this piece of cloth on my head, it doesn't make me more Muslim than I am.
And thank everyone for participating. Dr. Hassan for an incredible hour or 2 hours. It went by fast. So as you say, Dr. Hassan, maybe again.
Inshallah.
Inshallah, there you go. God willing.
Yeah.